Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Nicky Liu. Uh, he's an old guest in the podcast, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, and once again, my commendations on your academical success.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, so what's been going on? I mean, you have the the latest thing that seen in the papers was the Austrian government was vetoing the Schengen accession of Bulgaria and Romania. And as far as I could tell, the Romanians are quite pissed off about it. The official reasoning that the Austrian government was using is that it's about the migrants, the refugees that were coming through the Eastern Balkan route. Large numbers, they came, I think, 2015, 16. Um, and and the Austrian government argued that those two countries were uh, letting the people pass through instead of stopping them. Um, which to me, it's a very strange reasoning because so Bulgaria, their neighboring country. Well, I guess it would be Turkey, but then it's primarily Greece. I mean, Greece is definitely a Schengen zone state. So I think it was just a simple political game that they were playing.
100%. It's nothing else. Yeah, they're just dealing with the excuse me, with issues in the with the interior, but every country has to do this right now because of the global recession. It's just a political game, as you say, because it doesn't make it really doesn't make sense. Because there are I've read a few articles or headlines rather in newspaper about this issue and too, and main issues are the people working in the healthcare, uh, basically cheap labor, but you're making it extra hard for them, so it does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, my migration certainly is the main argument that they're using. But it's only so my impression was that those two countries, Romania, Bulgaria, they will eventually join Schengen anyways. You know, you might be delaying it by a year or two, but every year I'm sure that there will be discussion of those two countries joining the Schengen zone, and because of that persistent pressure, if you have two countries that desperately want to be part of it, you cannot, you know, keep pushing them out. So eventually the Austrian government will back down. But then the problem is, so at that point, there's a lot of damage being done. I think that the governments there are going to be extraordinarily angry because there's an economic impact, right? I mean, if you have border control checkpoints, you're slowing down the passage of goods and services and people movement. So it's going to have a negative impact on the economy of those countries. And so there's a lot of ill will that is being produced against the Austrian government, which could be harmful in later stages. I mean, if they like, for instance, I mean, if the Austrians want to appoint somebody in Brussels for one of the for any of the positions, let's say in the European Parliament or Central Bank of the European Union or anything like that, Um, why should the Romanians, Bulgarians not play their own political games?
Yeah, I mean, harm is already done. Uh, from what I've heard, Romanians are trying to boycott uh, Austrian products or anything made in Austria, or Austrian banks, pulling out the money from Austrian banks, etc. So damage is already done, already done.
Yeah, I mean, and also like I saw this thread this morning on Twitter. It was about the way how the uh, Austrian banks effectively were profiting from the eastward expansion of the EU that happened, well, in two stages, 2004, 2007. And then the Austrian state itself also profits from the labor of those Bulgarians and Romanians, right? Because they would be working in sectors with critical shortages like construction or healthcare. So um, yeah, it's a core periphery issue for sure, um, and perhaps some of the Romanian Bulgarian friends might be reminded of the you Austrian domination during the Habsburg Empire, where at least significant chunks of that of those countries were under Austrian rule effectively, and yeah, there's a sense of injustice for sure, and I think that the Austrian government would be very well advised to turn this ship around and admit those countries into Schengen. Um, yeah, so the other issue that you were mentioning was yeah migration and I mean how important are the migrants and also from which countries? Because there's a debate right now, I think in Germany. I saw this recently, the speech by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which was about shifting the country officially to the rank of an immigration country. Um, because historically, I mean, it's been an emigration country. I mean, people leaving the native country and going basically to US is probably the most common destination. Um, and um, and then the turnaround after World War II, right? You had the guest workers that were brought in from the 1950s onward. Um, but the guest workers were not guest workers. I mean, in fact, most of them were uh, permanent migrants. And this similar policy was done in Austria. But I have a feeling that right now it's possible to shift the discourse in Germany somewhat to the left because you don't let AfD, the anti-migrant party, into the government. You keep the cordon sanitaire. Uh, you keep the CDU Union Party out of the coalition government, and they would be the ones that they'd like to have the guest worker program, and not really wanting to acknowledge the you know the big migrant population. Versus, I think the political dynamic in Austria is much more conservative. I mean, you have the Green Party, right? They get to do a few things related to climate policies. Like an extra subsidy for I don't know, building solar panels or something. But then when it comes to the immigration and the refugee policies, they're like, well, no, they cannot speak up about anything, right? Um, and the Conservative Party, which is the senior coalition partner, well, they had 37% back in the last election. And if you look at the polls right now, they're at about 22% or something. Uh, so there's a vain hope, I believe, within the People's Party uh, to keep that conservative voter base that is anti-migrant. And so you have this positioning on keeping, Romania and Bulgaria out of Schengen. Then you have no acknowledgement of, migration as being an important part uh, of the national economy. Um, yeah, I think it's a political game that hasn't been working too well.
Yeah, sounds all right. I've not looked at the recent polls, but uh, I don't know. It's still the party that people voted for back then.
Yeah, I mean, and what would be, today's trend? I mean, you have uh, so the FPO, which they had their own scandal going on. I think they're doing quite well in the polls. I've seen recently. And so because okay, so the main issue of agitation from the Freedom Party perspective was, I mean, it's always about immigration, integration, refugees, etc. That we want to have less of those outsiders. And then I think they added a second topic recently because COVID restrictions were so central and they were so controversial, and so they were the only party within the parliament that was standing up, for instance, against the vaccine mandates. Um, and then what ended up happening was that the government passed it officially, and then I think only a month or two later they were reversing it, right? Because they realized, well, Omicron uh, wasn't as deadly as many experts had feared. Um, so, so it's so this actually, I mean, the COVID issue seemed to be one area where the Freedom Party had the upper hand ultimately, um, essentially banking on the salience of the disease decreasing, which it has in most places in the world except China. Um, uh, and I think so. The COVID issue, I believe, is because it's about this issue of like, do I have the freedom? Do I have the ability to control my own body with respect to the vaccinations, the masking, the quarantining, etc. Um, yeah, it has been one of the main mobilizing forces within the the political right wing. Um, and but then of course, like, okay, so then now if the disease passes, well then it's no longer a political topic, right? So it sort of fades into the background. I mean, can you still generate political legitimacy from talking about the COVID disease? Probably not. So anyway, what's your assessment of the exploiting the health issue as a political veg topic?
If they won't be doing it, some party will do it. It's it plays right in the wheelhouse for the right wing party, right? Is
Yeah, well, it has worked. I mean, it has worked somewhat. Not so. For instance, I mean, if you look at Germany, right? So you have this Reichsbürger movement, where so you had this prince who was getting uh, imprisoned, and then also there were like a few other people, like more than 2 dozen at least, that were also imprisoned. Um, I mean, and basically their argument was, well, that the current government is illegitimate, effectively the one that's democratically elected. Um, and part of the
no. They're saying that not the currently elected party, but the entire system is illegitimate.
right, the entire system. So just as a piece of context, I mean, so you have, so this is the prince is effectively he well he,
It's a
so
regime
according
change.
right according to the German constitution, I mean there is no princes and dukes and kings, etc., right? So it's just an honorary title which he had bequeathed because his ancestors had those princely titles, right? um and he sort of got into his head that he was the legitimate king of Germany. And it's quite interesting because even his own relatives that were questioned after his imprisonment were saying, well, that's just a crazy cousin. We have nothing to do with him.
Yeah, that's what nobility, the ex nobility nowadays does. They have to renounce their past. I've met a one scion of a of Austrian nobility once, and she was very much uh, try to uh, uh, defend that she was a civilian rather than a noble, and yeah, basically renounced their past, more or less. Still doing pretty good for themselves, but still.
Yeah, it's difficult to do it
Because they
because
don't want to do have to do anything with nobility anymore. They're Republicans. It's a survival thing.
yeah, it's difficult to do full renunciation because of the name, right? So I mean, as long as you have some, von or in your name, or if there's some honorary or there's like a prince title in it somewhere, unofficially even, um, yeah, it would be very hard to hide it unless you did a name change.
Yeah, of course. There's still some Habsburg-Lothringen dynasty members living in Austria. Actually, for a friend of mine, his wife has a dance school, and one of the pupils goes by the name Habsburg-Lothringen. They always make uh, they're always making little puns with these names.
Yeah, so I think the threat against the political system, against the democratic government, um,
Regime changing.
yeah, I mean, so I'm not so much worried about the prince himself. I think the biggest threat actually comes from the people that are working in the institutions. So the judges, the police officers, the army soldiers, um, the municipal employees, etc. So, what percent of the state apparatus is in favor of the coup? And I mean, it might be a very small percentage, but if they hold, just if they were located strategically in the right positions, um, so as to execute a successful coup. Basically, I mean, you'd have to strike all the big institutions at the same time, right? So the chancellery, the parliament, the constitutional court, and then the army base, I guess, in the capital. Um, and if there's enough um, members of the state bureaucracy that are on the side of the coup plotters, um, it could work out. I mean, like if you look at, for instance, the January 6th uprising in Washington D.C. To sustain Trump in the presidency. Well, the reason why it failed was because it's basically Trump and his supporters, you know, the masses, the mob, um, against the institutions. So I mean, the Capitol Police, the National Guard, the army leadership, and the Congress, most of the Congress. I mean, I guess maybe 80% of it. There were some Republicans that were pro-Trump, but most were not. Um, yeah, they're holding up against the Trump presidency, and therefore the coup had to fail, right? I mean, well, you really do need the internal institutional support in order to carry out the coup. Um, and that thing is scary. And the other thing is, so it simply because we say right now that the democratic institutions are stable. I mean, it doesn't say anything about what's going to happen in the near future because in the Weimar Republic, the Nazi Party had 5% in 1928, and in 1933 they went to 33%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So these things can change in an instant.
Now, what I find curious is the actually strength of the plot of the coup. Uh, what do you think about the timing of the coup, of the attempt, actually? Uh, since, as far as I know, since this is the second German Republic, right? Right. First was Weimar, yeah. Second Republic. Uh, never had a coup with this kind of strength happened before. But now, what do you think about the timing?
The timing in Germany. Uh, well, so okay, so right now, I think the country and the whole continent. I mean, there are extraordinary difficulties that where there were so many issues that were coming together at the same time because you have the pandemic, which was a disorienting experience. It came with the perception of whatever the World Economic Forum neoliberal power grab, like forcing people to take the vaccines, that sort of narrative. And then now that the pandemic is receding, immediately the new topic was the Ukraine war, uh, because of that invasion in February, uh, and there was this dark realization that the European, but especially the German economic model, was based on the importation of cheap Russian gas. And of course, you realize that because those gas supplies were being cut. I mean, now I think only a minuscule amount of European gas is of Russian origin. There's some compensation, I think, from Norway, and then the United States, and then maybe Qatar. I mean, there's a few sources where it can come in now, but But certainly, I mean, the gas price is exploding, and of course that impacts every sector of the economy. Because you need the gas in industrial production, and then of course people need to heat their homes. Um, well, but then the real wages go down, so then employers, to keep the labor, they have to increase the wages. But they cannot increase it, you know, to the full extent to make up for the inflation. So right now, I think there's a substantial amount of anger. There's a fear about the deindustrialization of the country, which no doubt is a possibility. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but it could happen. And with that deindustrialization, I mean, we're talking about further cuts in the standard of living, maybe on a permanent basis. Um, yeah, and then there's a perception that, well, okay, we're fighting a war that is happening far away. It's not directly tangential to our own national self-interest.
Yeah, that's where I would like to partially disagree. I'm not fighting that war. It's it's the Ukrainian people that are fighting the war, and the politicians the like to steer uh, push their interests. We're just in the middle of it.
Well, it's a complicated situation um because you cannot just think about, okay, I don't care about the Ukrainians. I mean, I think the issue on the next day, when you wake up, would have to be, if the Ukrainians get defeated and the Russian troops are on the Polish and Slovakian and the Romanian border and the Baltic, I mean, border, well, they've always been, but um, what does it mean for the security arrangement of the whole of Europe?
I mean, I
Um,
get it. That's why you meddle. And I'd like to clarify, it's not that I don't care about the Ukrainian people. They are fighting the war. The uh, the moral high ground is on their side. They are fighting a defensive war, but it is still not my war.
yeah, well, it's I think the argument can be made easily, like the further away it is from Europe. I mean, because I mean, if you look like Syria and Libya, they've been fighting a civil war for over a decade at this point. Um, and Yemen, it's another one of those places. Um, it's far enough away from Europe where it's also reflected in the policy discourse, right? You're not going to see any European politician that will give too many speeches um, regarding those Middle East wars. The exception would be during the times when the you know, refugees were coming, basically by crossing Turkey. So Turkey is the absorption state that the Europeans bribe to keep the refugees in. But in the moments where it doesn't work, then they get transited further to Europe. Um, but I think the problem with Ukraine is that it's too close to the European core. I mean, and it is a neighboring state, quite literally, and I think looking back at it, I think the original mistake from the European policymaker perspective was not that they were too aggressive in pushing the Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. Um, Looking back, actually, it was the opposite. I think that because now they were saying, okay, we're going to give you the EU candidacy status, but I think maybe this should have been done at an earlier stage. And the same thing with the NATO, where, okay, the NATO application was going back to 2008. which was many years before the Crimea invasion. Now, of course, back then, I mean, nobody could have predicted that Crimea would be invaded, but in a historical analysis, I would say that it's the fact that the West has not been aggressive enough in incorporating Ukraine that the end result becomes the war. Um, yeah, so I know that it's the opposite interpretation from the Russian ones because the Russians say, I mean, if you remember before the invasion, they were like, well, okay, we're not going to invade Ukraine, but then you're going to have to pull NATO out of the whole of Eastern Europe.
I mean, what we're banking on. Do you think that if when you once you uh, uh, once you absorbed Ukraine into the European sphere, you think Russia's going to be next? Russia was precisely declared enemy by the West. There was no chance for Russia to join the European Union or anything or
Well,
NATO.
not for Russia. I think for Russia it might be a little early, but for Ukraine, I mean, I think a proposition should have been made in an earlier point. Uh, so because
But what's the strategy behind it? To contain Russia even further back into behind the Urals or something? What's the global strategy here?
well, the strategy is to prevent war, right? I mean, it's a signal to Putin that you know you're not just screwing with Ukraine. I mean, you're going to be screwing with the entire West if you send your troops across the border to Ukraine.
So you
Um,
want so your idea was to back the bear at so that their back is to the wall.
yeah, okay. Well, so what's the definition of back against the wall? Because so I think the main problem in the Russian political system is that in order for this mafia state, and it is effectively a mafia state, I mean, with the big Don being Putin himself, to retain power, it has to grab the land from the neighboring countries, or at least that's the story that it tells itself. I mean, um, because there's this idea of like the TV war, right, where as long as you deliver images of triumphant Russian or Wagner army soldiers, taking or seizing neighboring territory, right? Um, it's going to increase the approval rating of the Don, and so in order to improve European national security, um, that arrangement has to change in some way. I mean, either you have a mafia regime in place, but it's focused really on just being contained within itself. I mean, think of North Korea or Hungary. I mean, which are kind of I guess also dictatorships of varying intensity, but they're contained within themselves. I mean, there's no not necessarily military capacity to storm the neighbor. Um, but that would have been okay. I think the Europeans could have lived with that. In fact, the gas contracts were signed, right? Nord Stream 1 and 2. So obviously the Europeans were condoning like a passive, non-aggressive mafia state. Um, or the other option would have been that the West would have to wait for regime change to occur. Um, but that's from the outside. I mean, this cannot be controlled, right? It cannot be steered. Um, so I mean, yeah, I think in terms of the European security arrangements, I mean, so because the West was saying originally that Ukraine is a gray zone, right, belongs to nobody, and then the Russian perspective was Ukraine belongs into the Russian Empire, and it's big, and it's big. I think it's because of that asymmetric um, position between the two sides, the Western versus the Russian, um, that we end up with the war. Now, it all ends up being Monday morning quarterbacking because I wasn't saying back in 2008. I guess it was before my era of political interest, maybe. But I wasn't saying back then that that Ukraine should have been part of the West. So I mean, I would say that's why I'm not a credible lecturer of the political leadership back then. Um, but I'm just making a strategic analysis of the historical situation with the facts that we have today. Obviously, the facts on the ground today. Um, yeah, but in any case, I mean, I don't agree with backing the bear into the wall narrative. I mean, because the bigger question that the Russians should ask themselves is why is there no Russian Union in in Europe, right? I mean, why is it that it's the European Union and it's the NATO alliance that keeps expanding? Uh, I mean, I think that's an even more that's a more fundamental question you know than the Russians accusing the West of stealing those Eastern European countries from the clutches. I think the answer is pretty simple. I mean, you just look at I don't know the Human Development Index and the GDP per capita of countries like Poland and the Baltic states and the Czech Republic. You know, I guess compare it from the communist era, so the Russian domination era, and compare it to what happened after 1990, right? And it's so clear that so that liberal capitalist democratic systems they they're more desirable to the people than the system that the Russians were offering, which is basically it's a mixture of poverty and authoritarianism and corruption. So all three elements together, and that kind of system is not very popular. I mean, it is good. Like if you belong to the ruling class, the nomenclature, then yeah, I think it's good because you're basically you leech off of the rest of society. Um, but for the ordinary person, I think it's not a good system. Um, and so that's why I think yeah that's why the Russian mafia system I think it is going to be on the defensive. Um, yeah, okay, so okay, so the complicated question is regarding the larger end outcome. I mean, if so, it is at this point. I find it extraordinarily unlikely that that the Ukraine is going to be defeated completely. There's a discussion about whether there'll be a second round of invasion, where there's like 300,000 Russians that were mobilized that are stationed in Belarus in the northeastern border. Um, and they're ready to make another strike at Kiev. Uh, my impression is that if this is true, these soldiers are going to be even worse off than back in February. Because back in February, I mean, if you think like the elite Russian troops, which is the VDV, which is the paratroopers, the paratrooper infantry, plus the guard tank army, right? Those were the crown jewels of the Russian army. Well, they were all deployed in the first weeks of the invasion, and they were struggling to take Kiev, and they didn't do it eventually. So now, if you say, okay, we're gonna refill the ranks of these units with mobilized soldiers, that is to say, not with professional, right? With basically civilians that you know give like 2 months of shooting training, and you try to send them again on the same in the same direction with the same objective of taking the capital. I mean, that's going to be a much worse performance than what they have done in the this year. Uh, the other side of it is like how strong is the Ukrainian army at present? So there was an interview with the Ukrainian general Zalushny, um, and yeah, he was asked about what he would need to conquer back the Donbass and Crimea, and he said, "Well, we need 700 tanks and you know 500 artillery pieces and so forth." Um, and the implication is that he doesn't have it yet, or will he ever get it right in those quantities? And then the Western armies themselves, because the problem also is, okay, the Western armies are much bigger than the Russian for sure, but the Western armies are saying, well, okay, we want to keep at least, I don't know, 80% of our stockpile, right, in terms of ammunition, in terms of vehicles, etc., because we need it for our internal defense. So then, of course, that means that they're not going to give that away. Um, some countries have. I mean, the Baltic states have. I think they gave up at least a third of the military stocks. Um, yeah, it's a big question. Like, how deep do the NATO countries want to draw into the stocks? Um, and what's complicated also is like we don't know about the military capacity. So in Germany, they said they're going to increase the military spending. Poland has done it for sure. Um, the Czech Republic, which is one of the experts in especially like small arms production, like pistols, machine guns, and so forth. They've increased military production. Um, yeah, so it's an open ended kind of situation where I'm not sure whether the Ukrainians are able to reproduce the breakthrough successes that they have done in Kharkiv and in Kherson. Um, they say, well, okay, we're gathering the forces and we want to strike out, get Donbass, Zaporizhia back under control. Yeah, and then the Russians are saying the same thing now about, okay, well, we might strike from Belarus again. Um, so yeah, I mean, it was so that war is going to uh, drag on for a bit. But I think there's going to be a point of mutual exhaustion, and And when exhaustion is reached, then I think you will see some kind of diplomatic solution. Well, solution might be an extreme word here because I think because solution means that we're not going to see any more problems in that region, right? I think basically what we're waiting for is some kind of ceasefire agreement, um, which would buy time.
Buy time for who?
Well, it would be on both sides, right? So as long as the Ukrainian borders hadn't been, reestablished, let's say the internationally recognized borders in 1991, um, I think there's going to be an expectation that if we have a ceasefire agreement, um, that it will be temporary and both sides will, rearm. Like they would strengthen the military forces, and then within maybe half a year or 1 year, there'll be another showdown.
Modern wars have the tendency, if they drag on for more than a couple months, they're gonna they will be dragged on for years or decades even. Uh, like you know, uh, for example, the Iraqi war, was it took a while, but I mean the actual common part was swift, but the actual occupation uh, dragged on for a little longer. Or Afghanistan, if uh, if NATO didn't withdraw, occupation would still have required more resources, and it would have dragged on forever. Or the Korean War, still no cease, still not has still not concluded. Or India-Pakistan, the war has still not concluded. Republic of China and People's Republic of China has not concluded. And I'm my guess is the Russian-Ukrainian war will have the same tendency.
Yes. So that's a possibility, right? I mean, basically, you have a flame that goes on in the background, and we're going to have interval phases of low intensity conflict, but then it could flare up into a high intensity conflict. I mean, the reality on the ground right now is already that we see, uh, the partitioning, because you already have these four people's republics that were now officially incorporated, into the Russian Federation. So from the Russian side, I mean, there already is the attempt to establish the state administration in the occupied territories. And then yeah, and then on the Ukrainian side, I mean, I don't see any willingness to compromise on essentially surrendering territory. Um, I mean, they're very gung ho about the reconquest of Crimea. And under those circumstances, I think that we are going to see that conflict continue for a while. And of course, what makes it so difficult is that right now, because of the aggression having already happened, I mean, you know, this EU NATO integration is not going to work. Because I mean, of course, like at the moment where, like, if NATO decided, okay, we're going to include Ukraine and we're going to impose a deadline for the the Russian retreat. Well, then we're in the World War III territory, right? Because then it would have to be enforced by NATO. So under Article 5, and then there would be a shooting war between NATO and Russia, which Russia will lose for sure. But then, it's a big question whether that will be followed up by nuclear escalation. Um, and so that's why the whole argument of like, okay, Russia's going to be backed against the wall doesn't make any sense to me, because is even so the word so let's say the worst case scenario is that the entire Russian army gets destroyed in Ukraine. So basically, they only have, police units back home. Well, but on top of that, they also have the nuclear strike force. So even even in the worst case scenario, I mean, there is, I think, absolutely no threat to the Russian sovereignty, right? I mean, no, there's nobody in NATO who'd be crazy enough to march onto Moscow and topple the Russian government. Um, so in a narrow sense, I think the backing against the wall um, of the bear. I mean, that doesn't make any sense on a practical level. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's yeah, but I guess yeah, it's difficult to resolve that conflict. And I mean, again, going back to the internal domestic quarrels, I guess closer to home in Europe, Austria, Germany, and those places. Um, there is a fundamental question that needs to be asked, which is, yeah, what is the future of the society given the challenges that we have right now? So that is to say, okay, we have undermining of the democratic order effectively because people don't believe the system works for them. We have the rise in precarious jobs, so unstable, insecure employment made worse by inflation crisis, so the economic problems. And then now we have the new challenge, which is the ecological crisis. Effectively, I mean, we have drought this year, but which, in my view, I mean, in terms of the climate future that I'm seeing in front of us, I mean, I would say that this year, having so far been considered to be one of the hottest summers and the driest ones, um, is still a cool year relative to the future that's in front of us. Um, and so then ultimately it means that we have to teach people to live with less, to be economically more modest. And that's a difficult proposition because of the loss aversion theorem in behavioral economics, right? Which says that, losing something is 100 times more painful than the happiness you get from earning more income. Right. So of course, the behavioral economists, they make the util assumption. So in the utilitarian theorem, right? It's like, I mean, the utilitarian theory says that like your utils can be measured, right? In increment units. So let's say, I don't know, if you get a job that doubles your income, then your utils goes up by 10 points, right? I mean, there's just sort of like, I think it's an abstract concept. I mean, I don't think um, it's like scientifically defensible, right? Meaning that you can scientifically reconstruct a measurement that is universally accepted. Um, but then the assumption would be that, well, if you lose your job, or if you have to switch to a lower earning job, then your utils will go down by 100 or something, right? Uh, and that is the shock, the shock to the psychology, um, of the whole of the Western population. So every Western country has to go through this, because so the solutions that was being sold to us, okay, about alternative energy futures, they look promising, but they're not happening at a pace that we need, right? So, for instance, I mean, if you look at, like, I don't know, solar efficiency, right? Solar panel efficiency. That's to say, basically the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity is going down, which is good. I mean, it's in the early 2000s. I mean, it was very uneconomic, and now solar panels are very economic. I mean, they're cheaper than fossil fuel. Um, yeah, but you still have to do mining. I mean, in order to get the whatever quartz and the metal pieces that go into the solar panel, rare earth minerals. I just saw a chart this morning. It was about demand and supply for copper, because I think for a lot of, I believe electric vehicle batteries, copper would be one of the input resources. So we're seeing an explosion in copper demand because of the, I guess, electric vehicle revolution. And
Yeah, I
actually,
think say, electronics in general.
yeah, um, and we are seeing, and then in terms of the projected supply of copper, apparently we are expecting a decline. Um, so I don't know what regions are focusing on copper. I'm assuming there's some sub-Saharan Africa, maybe South America would be those regions. Um, so I mean, so if we expect a decline in supply, it means based on the known reserves of copper, or is the assumption, well, I mean, we've already explored everything that, everywhere where there could be copper, and then, so we're just going to expect less production ultimately. I mean, less extraction, because we can't find anything. Um, well, according to the market logic, you know, prices of copper would basically have to explode to reflect the scarcity of copper. Um, but and so basically, even from that narrow resource standpoint, I think our wealth is very much in question. So the only way out of that, well, you'll be, well, it would have to be some form of innovation, right? Where you find another resource input that can replace the function of copper. But then, I mean, but then if you use another mineral resource where the demand is also significantly exploding, well, then you're gonna find the same problems in 10 years, right?
Well, there are materials that have better conductivity than copper. Maybe, for example, silver, gold, platinum. But those resources, of course, are even more rare than copper.
Right. So ultimately, I mean, we are facing, real resource constraints. I mean, so let's say if you build electronics to be durable, right? Where, for instance, like, so I'm using the iPhone now, whatever, 2, 3 years or so, and the battery is effectively shit. So I have to charge it basically half of the day. Um, and so I think the signal that Apple Corporation is sending me is that I should get a new iPhone. Now, if you had a system, however, where if you created an iPhone or any telephone to last for, let's say, 10 years, which I think you could easily do, um, then the resource consumption could go down. But then the company would be making less money, obviously, right? Because it presumably still be selling it at the same price.
Uh, the capitalistic system demands that. But the strong argument is, counter argument is why we don't have nice things that last forever. Uh, if you have if you get something new every year, that means the things are getting better. From technology wise, they're more uh, have more power, and can do more things. So it's kind of a necessary step for quick development. Where if you have a telephone that can last for like 200 years, you have the same telephone for 200 years. Nothing is gonna change. No development.
Yeah, it's going to be less innovation, but I mean, and but then that might not be too bad. I don't know. I mean, if you so because the big question is, okay, well, what do we want the phone to accomplish, right? I mean, would I necessarily be unhappier if I was still playing Snake on the Nokia 3310? Um, well, I mean, okay, so the answer would be yes if I knew that there was an iPhone out there that could do 100 times more things. But in a world presumably where the new thing doesn't get developed at all, I might be content with playing Snake, right?
Uh, yeah, I mean it's not so much about personal, but whether you're content or not. People have been content with their lives for centuries. Back in the days when life was still feudal, they never they never knew that things would ever change. Like they gonna be peasants forever or serfs forever, and the generations to come will be serfs or peasants or no nobles, whatever. If you don't think about change, then you have to be content with life, right? Like the North Koreans, if they never knew how world outside is, they're gonna be content with their perfect little world.
Um, yeah, yes. I mean, and so here's the difficulty. I mean, in practice, um, which is that, okay, so we like to have the progress narrative for sure, but we also like the idea of sustainability, I think. And because right now, I mean, these two goals are conflicting with each other, because it seems to me that we are generating the progress only on the backs of reducing sustainability, from an ecological viewpoint. Um, and so if those are the two extremes that I'm having to choose, I mean, obviously, if there was no trade off, then of course I always choose progress. But if there's a trade off, I would say I always choose sustainability, because um, you know, because the biological instinct of survival is the thing that comes first. I mean, right? Because without survival, I mean, all of the other things you're enjoying is going to be worthless. Um, but then there's other people who say, well, even if the climate catastrophe is going to kill me in 20 years or whatever, 30 or however many years, um, the fact that I can enjoy the gadgets and the technology today will probably make up for my early demise. Um, it's like I wanted to have, even if it's like, okay, we are like, to say we have a golden period of 100 years, and of course, I mean, of course, a lifetime is probably a little bit less than that. But if I get to receive, if only my generation gets to have the golden age, um, then I would want to take it. So that's the logic that's also there. Well, it's not one that you like to admit to, because you don't want to sound like an asshole to future generations. Um, but it's a possible logic, and it's a logic that we're living right now, right? Because it's not like I've said I'm going to take this computer and this phone, I'm going to chuck it out, and I'm going to live in the forest, um, with minimal connectivity, and I hunt my own food, and I sew my own clothes, etc., etc. Right? I mean, there's not many people who are doing that, right? And even if they wanted to, I mean, they couldn't do it. Um, so yeah, I mean, we're effectively enjoying um, the current lifestyle pretty much at borrowed time. Um,
You know what I've with what I have a problem with what you just said, the we part, the our generation as a with as a collective, uh, about the golden age. It said that our parental generation was had the golden age, whilst we millennials are 40% poorer than the former generation. Uh, but I would still not blame the entire society, the collective of our parental generation for enjoying the golden age and then don't think about the decline. Because what exactly could it's not our parents were hard workers, but what and that's the thing. Well, what uh, I cannot blame our parents or our parental generation for how things went when they didn't have the power to decide uh, how society develops. It's not the entire collective. You know what I mean? I'm
yeah, I
saying
mean,
it's the rich people who decided the fate of society.
right. Okay, so I subscribe here to the Marxist standpoint, who was one of the founders in my discipline, sociology. Um, who says that history is made by people, so we cannot sort of deny that the things that the externalities, the environmental damages, the lack of sustainability. I mean, we cannot deny that it was done by human hands. Um, but it's not made of our choosing, because if everybody works within the system, right? So even if it's like whatever, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, the top guy, the people at the top, and then the workers who work for them, right? It's a system, right? That is to say, like, even if any one of those people within the system say, well, I don't like the system. Well, okay, you can retreat, right? You can try to retreat. Maybe you can find spaces here and there where you can hide from the influence of capitalism, but it doesn't do anything to the system's, existence.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. Yeah, even the rich guy doesn't have a choice really.
Yeah, so it's a system that is in operation, and the system only works because everybody is continuing to play the part. I mean, everybody's. I mean, I can write like the communist diatribe in my blog, but I'm still gonna go out and buy an iPhone. I mean, I'm still gonna, you know, take an airplane to fly to Europe and contribute to the carbon record, right? So I mean, it's um, so as long as we all play into that system, and it's going to be intrinsically a coercive system, and um, and the best thing that we can do effectively, I think. I mean, well, it would be education, and then maybe it's going to result in some ecological sustainable reforms, um,
What do you mean by that? What do
and
you
then
mean by
hope for the best.
education? Education. You mean
But
indoctrination? You mean teaching a different system in school?
yeah, well, so the yes, I mean, because so because at the end of the day, I mean, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what is it that I want to accomplish for human beings? So for that, I would go back to the Greeks. So the idea of eudaimonia, right, which means it's something between like happiness and contentment, right, or Glückseligkeit, German. Um, so okay, so that's the thing that you know we want to accomplish eventually for humanity. Um, and then okay, once you define the goal, then the second is question is, well, what does that mean for my life? What does it mean for everybody's lives, and how do I get there? Um, and if so, we cannot abolish capitalism because we're all living in that system. Um, but we can try to create alternative spaces, and we can have pockets of resistance in which non-capitalist structures are being built up. And so the most practical answer to, well, what the hell do you mean by alternative structures? I think it goes back to universal basic income. So there would be one of the most concrete steps that could be offered. Um, yeah, using the instruments that we already have, because the government already knows how to tax people and spend the money, right? So it's an instrument that we know that the current institutions have the capacity to do it. Um, and yeah, and then there would be sort of you know there would be one first step towards utopia. I think that there's many more things that would have to be followed up with. But but yeah, the first step to take for sure. Um, right. Okay. So there's another thing that I was recently clued into. I think like 3 days ago, they made the announcement about fusion energy. I don't know whether you followed that. Um,
I've read a few headlines. Yeah.
yeah. So lab in California, I believe. So as far as I understand, I mean, they scientists were successful in generating more energy than they fed into the, I guess, whatever the engine is called,
Reactor.
the reactor. Yeah, and it was apparently not done using magnetic field. It was using inertia. As I just had a conversation yesterday about it. And so to me, it sounds promising, but I think the only question that matters for these kinds of things is not are you able to do it to show it experimentally, but are you able to produce the electricity at industrial scale? I think that's ultimately what we want, and I think that from that vantage point, it seems to me that we are very far away from industrial application, even with a with the current discovery, and without without being able to have industrial application. I don't know. It's well, I would certainly say. So as a funder, as a government agency, I would say, yeah, I would continue to fund these scientists, these postdocs, professors, whoever's working on it. Continue doing your work. Um, but yeah, but how promising is it going to be? And also, like, so from a policymaker perspective, I guess the policymaker always wants to know what's the time horizon. So okay, when is it industrially available? How long will it take to build these reactors, to get them up and running? Um, and will it be in time for achieving the net zero carbon record? Right now, so my impression, so using the existing technologies, I think the governments in the world, they're basically saying solar, wind, maybe hydro, and then some countries say nuclear, and natural gas. So that's supposed to be the energy mix. And I spoke with an engineer about this, and he actually likes natural gas because the idea is that, okay, so the sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing, the water is not always running in the river. Um, but if you have like the natural gas, you store it in the tank in the facility, right? You can instantly get the turbines running, right? By injecting the gas. So whenever you have a shortfall, any time you have a shortfall in electric supply, you can always turn on the gas turbines, right? Uh, so that gives a lot of flexibility. Now the problem with the natural gas, however, is that, okay, you have half the amount, so per kilowatt hour production, of CO2 emissions compared to oil, petroleum. But I don't know if you want to do net zero on the carbon record. I think that then the gas would be problematic. Then the other solution that you'd have to think of is the carbon capture. Like, can this particular technology be improved? Um, so again, one thing I was reading about was storing CO2 in cement production, because I guess the process of creating the cement is releasing the CO2. And if in the process of creating it, like instead of letting it leak into the atmosphere, you you capture it within like the confined space in the factory, um, and you can store that CO2 in the cement itself. So it would be, I guess, in some molecule form that I guess it would be like a solid form, right? Because this the cement brick, I don't know, it would be solid, right? Um, yeah, like those things could certainly be improved, and I think that would sound quite promising, and I'd be in favor of that. But yeah, so there was this article in the Economist. It was like last month or so, um, and they were quite open. They were saying we can forget about net zero. As you know, we can forget about the 1.5 Celsius target. So because their argument is that we should probably shoot for 1.8. 1.8 would give a little bit more flexibility. That is to say, we can continue carbon pollution for a few more years, and then or maybe the adjustments doesn't have to be as steep.
Or the difficulty level.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a big question, right? So okay, so even so, if you at the point where you get to net zero, I mean, like, are we freezing the? No, freezing would be the extreme word, but are we sustaining the temperature at the given level? I mean, or do we have the lag time where it will continue to climb? I mean, it's and because I mean because nobody's talking about a world in which we could go back to the pre-industrial atmosphere, right? I mean that's not happening. I mean that's um not even conceivable.
I mean, there's the carbon capture technology, but it's a uh, it's a propaganda stick because it requires energy to put CO2 down to the earth. And where does the energy come from? From burning fossil fuels. I mean, Iceland does it. They use geothermal energy, but it only works there, and it's not very effective.
So this is the Icelandic version of carbon capture is capture the air. So it's almost like filtering the atmosphere, filtering the air.
Yeah, and it only works there, and it's not a lot that they actually manage to capture. If you do it anywhere else in the world, it requires a lot of energy, and it's not worth it. It would be
Uh,
not worth it anywhere else in the world.
so my understanding of carbon capture technology, because there's so many of them, right? I mean, the guy I was reading about, you know, using algae growth, like the plankton on the seas, because they well because they are naturally whatever filtering from the atmosphere on the I guess on the ocean surface, and then once they accumulated enough of the CO2, then they usually sink uh, to the ocean ground. Um, and so there were some people were talking about you're encouraging the algae growth. But the problem is, like, I mean, we already have, so maybe 30% of the atmospheric CO2 already gets absorbed by the oceans. We have ocean acidification, we have blooming algae, um, but then the fish are dying off. I mean, I think, I mean, fish is one of the, especially like for coastal people, it would be a big nutritional source. Um, yeah, I mean, to the extent, I mean, like if most of the waterways you can no longer, you know, have your fish there, and even maybe industrial fish farming might be threatened too. So I'm not sure whether that is the best solution. Um, yeah, I think the best solution is probably like within industrial applications. So like in the industrial process, in like instead of blowing the CO2 out in the atmosphere, you you try to inject it into some material that would prevent the release into the atmosphere. Because I mean, in industry, I mean, is what? I mean, maybe a third of the CO2 production. I mean, it wouldn't take care of the other ones. I mean, like the latest thing that this morning I saw a headline about Virgin Island, which is like an airplane operator. Um, they want to do a carbon neutral flight, airplane flight over the Atlantic. Now, I don't know how much of it is PR. I mean, like how serious is that? But I guess the idea is to use um cooking oil waste. So because there's a lot of cooking oil like if you use it a couple of times and you start chucking it out, but instead you collect it, you put it into the I don't know, the tank of the airplane.
Okay, sounds like pure stunt to me because it's not an infinite source, infinite resource. Cooking oil. Uh, that reminds me back. What's like a natural gas? Where does natural gas come from? Is it what you get from the waste from farm animals, from cattle, or is it propane gas?
Well,
Uh,
I thought natural gas comes from the ground,
yeah,
like the shale gas or
that's
whatever.
what I want to get at. Because farm animal poop is not a infinite resource where you can get enough natural gas for industrial level use. So you have to dig it up. Same as coke or mm, coal that you get from coking wood. It may be enough for cooking for households for hearths, but it's not enough for industrial level. If you want industrial level coal, you have to dig it up from the ground.
Yeah, yes. That's unfortunately the case, and I mean, ultimately, like it's so there's always like two approaches, right? There's two solutions. Um, Either innovation, right, which means you have to transition to a source that is not carbon polluting, or you have to reduce consumption, which means, I mean, frankly, it means poverty, right? So it means consuming less things. You know, not heating your apartment fully in the winter and all these other things. Um, yeah, so I was listening to a few podcasts by Bjorn Lomborg. He's a Danish um, environmental philosopher. And I mean, so his argument is that so okay, so he's in favor of carbon mitigation for sure. I mean, he's not definitely not a climate denialist, but he says that the best way to deal with problems that we have known is through innovation. So the idea is like you would have to find a technology that would be so cheap that it doesn't make any sense to use the carbon polluting sources. Um, and so for coal energy, innovation has worked. I mean, we have to say that. I mean, if you look at the demand for coal, okay, at least up until the Ukraine war crisis, but at least before that, and certainly in the U.S., it's still the case because the U.S. has huge natural gas deposits. It's still the case that um, that coal mining is completely uneconomic. I mean, the labor cost that it takes to dig out a coal to produce a certain number of terawatt hours, um, that is so prohibitively high relative to the other sources. I mean, the reason why coal mining could thrive for so many years was that it wasn't facing this kind of cost competition from other sources of energy.
I mean, coal has become out of fashion since the discovery of oil, right? From a physics perspective, the industrial revolution was sparked by using more coal for the engines. But then they discovered oil, which has a higher energy density, means uh, less mass uh, of the resource produces more energy, and was the case with oil, which sparked the second industrial revolution with mobiles, etc. And well, nuclear energy should have been the third the third step to the third should have sparked the third industrial revolution. But since it's even rarer than mineral oils, it it remains just a it couldn't replace oil entirely.
Yeah, well, so nuclear energy. I mean, so Lomborg is a big supporter of nuclear energy, um, and and I'm not a supporter. I'm a tolerator of nuclear energy. Um, because so I'm so because the main objections to the nuclear energy has not been resolved finally. So it's about safety. Then it's about waste storage. Um, and yeah, it's and the cost is also a factor. So it's okay. So there's basically two stages on the cost side, right? So you have the point at which you uh in which you build these nuclear plants. So at the stage where you're building it, that's where the high cost is. Now, if you have it built, so if it's just at the maintenance and the usage phase, that's when it becomes very economic because then the cost is low. The cost is low. The amount of electricity gained is huge. Um, and it's also reliable to the extent that um, yeah, that it's not dependent on, for instance, like the sun or the wind. Um, in regions where maybe you don't have as much of uh, sunshine, for instance. Um, but there's also problems for sure. Um, so if you study, for instance, the French energy situation this year, which it was an unusually difficult year, so they maybe didn't experience that beforehand. So the French, they built the nuclear plants in the mid 70s to the end of the 80s, right? So it's a within a certain time frame. That's when basically the entire fleet was getting built, and which means that around the same time they're all developing the same aging issues. In other words, now the maintenance cost. I mean, it was low for many years, and then the maintenance cost goes up in a steep curve in a very short period of time. They had to shut down, I believe, more than half of the nuclear plants this year. They're now having to import a lot of electricity. Like, so it used to be that France was a reliable energy exporter. Now this year they were a net importer because there were so many plants that were down at the same time for the maintenance reasons. Another reason why they were down was because you built the plants to the waterways, so to the rivers. The river were at a depressed level because of the drought, and you always need the water access because you need to cool the reactors. So, and of course, and then right now, I mean, because also so gas would be one of the backup supply sources. Um, but the Russians are cutting the gas. Okay, so right now, I mean, it's a really bad year in terms of the energy situation for France. And I believe that they have, like, I looked at the European map recently. I believe they have the one of the highest rates of energy inflation um, in the continent.
How high would you say is that? I'm curious.
The what?
How high is the price raise?
I I I don't look at the
Because I'm
numbers closely.
European. I'm European, and I know what I'm paying for my energy compared to last year or this year. Next year, I'm gonna pay 75% more for energy. 75%.
75% more. Right. So there's a ripple effect, obviously, through the entire economy, right? Which is to say that, like, so, okay, so if so, because for most people, energy is a basic necessity. So we're not gonna freeze in our apartments. So then, usually, what that means is, less going to the restaurant, less going to the movies, um, less, like, vacations, meeting friends, blah blah blah. So
Yeah,
the
for most people, I'm still doing that, but I'm cutting back on my dream of ever getting a property of my own. It's basically it. I'm maintaining my lifestyle at the cost of my future.
Yeah. So I mean, if that's the orientation of the population, right? It so yeah. So then we're going to have um cuts in the standard of living. And it just is another data point to show that a lifestyle is not going to be as good as for the previous generations. And it's interesting that it's a deterioration that is witnessed through the lifetime. So because at least for our generation, I mean, we know for sure that, whatever the first 3 decades were still pretty good, right? Um, we don't know how the next few decades are going to be like. Um, and then I mean, and then for any succeeding younger generation, I mean, there's definitely going to be the baseline is going to be at the lower end of things. But then, okay, so I'm a little bit worried about this Extinction Rebellion crowd, mostly consisting of younger people. Um,
What is that?
so Extinction Rebellion, so there's either the environmental activists that glue themselves on the street
Oh, okay.
and the paintings in the art museums. And so their reasoning is,
From what I've heard, those people are actually getting paid for what they do. The funders are, I mean, they can be behind that, but they still have to get paid by someone. And from what I've heard, it's rich people that feel guilty are paying those people to do those stunts, which I find interesting.
the rich people who feel guilty about the, the airplanes to Davos that they're taking for to attend these climate summits and conferences to reduce carbon emissions. But I guess I guess what they mean is carbon emissions for poor people, effectively, right? It's the peasants that have to consume less or something. I don't know. Um, yeah, I mean, okay, so whatever the motivation there is, so okay, so what they're saying effectively is, if we just do protest banners, so um, and we go on the street on Sunday, whatever, then the media is going to ignore us, right? So if we're doing the well-behaved protests, then we don't get the attention. But if we destroy the paintings and if we glue to the street so that the ambulance with like a heart attack patient can no longer go through, so they basically die on the way to the hospital. Um, then at the very least, like we get attention. Um,
Well, there are a few countries where regular as protests do work and the government listen. China,
yeah.
of
So
course, as you said, in Europe you can protest however much you want. Yeah, they just ignore you. With protests in China, if the protest grows in a considerable size, they will consider.
yeah. Well, I mean, so China's the other extreme where basically, because you don't have democratic elections and you don't have rule of law and you don't have the free press. And so why are these institutions helpful? Well, because it's about feedback to the ruling class, right? So like if let's say if you're losing votes in the elections, if you receive criticism in the media, and if the independent judiciary imprisons the leaders for corruption, um it is a direct feedback for the rulers that they should behave and they change their ways. Now the problem is, like, if you're in an authoritarian country, that you basically cut off these feedback mechanisms. So the only time that you notice that things are going wrong is if you have these big protests.
But
Um,
big protests are still happening in democratic system countries. How do you explain that? I thought they had their feedback. Still, people still protesting.
yeah, but okay, so because there's another peculiar feature that comes to the zero COVID, right? Because so previously, so there's always unrest in China because it's the biggest country in the world. I mean, you have 1.4 billion people. I mean, there's always something going wrong. I mean, you have the situation in Hong Kong, right? The democracy protests, and you have the Xinjiang situation, right, where some people were accused of terrorism. Then you do the re-education camps, and then internally you always have the human rights activists, right, who are like, well, you have to preserve human rights, and then you have um, like the land, the peasant protests usually, like because in order to redevelop the countryside, they have to basically convert rural land into urban land, and so usually the government just kicks out the peasants, so you have peasant protests. But it's always localized. It's always specific problems. But with zero COVID, they were screwing the entire population, right? Because anybody could have the could fail the COVID test, the green pass, and so if the protests would have run for extended periods of time, so more than 2 days, it could have threatened regime stability. But I mean, so in the Western countries, I mean, like when you say, well, the people are protesting, I mean, what kind of protests are you talking about? I mean, it's okay. You have the Extinction Rebellion, so we're talking like 500 people maybe on any given location, right? Um, and then they do a couple of things. I mean, there's a little bit of theater, 4 or 5 hours, and then
Right,
people are
so
tired, and
religion
then
every Friday. Then you have Black Lives Matter. Then you have something about deep state and that the election was stolen.
yeah, but it's like so as a sociologist, I mean, I'm always asking for the operational question, which is, so how many of these protests are happening? How many participants are there, and how long does it last? Right. So, and I
Oh,
would think that,
when we're talking about France, you have the yellow vest.
right. Well, okay, for the yellow vest, I mean, this form of protest that was quite significant. But it's still a specific constituency that was being hurt, right? It's the people that didn't vote for Macron, right? So it's definitely a minority because we know that the majority voted for Macron, about 2/3. So it was a minority that was voting against Macron, against his policies. Uh, it was it was a minority that was affected by the diesel tax because that was the Macron policy. So, and it's quite interesting because the people that were cheering on Macron, right, they were saying, "Oh, this is one of the greatest environmental policies in French history," and but those were done by the urbanites, right? The people living in Paris who ride the metro, the subway, right? They don't even own a car, and they are the ones who are cheering on the diesel tax increase. And then the people that were against the diesel tax increase were the people who were driving diesel cars, who are usually people living in the countryside, and they have to commute to the cities for their job. Because also, like, the cost of living in Paris evidently is higher than in the countryside. So, so who are the people living in Paris? Well, it's the upper middle class, right? So your doctors, the lawyers, the professors, they're living in the city because they can afford the high rents. And then the people who are living in the countryside is lower middle class. But they still commute to the big city because that's where the jobs are, right? So yeah, it's a specific protest, but but I still don't see any indications that a second French Revolution is imminent. Because I mean, when the first French Revolution happened in 89, 1789, well, what are we talking about? The citizen Louis Capet, which was Louis the 16th. Um, just two predecessors before him, Louis the 14th, right? That was the height of this absolutist state, right? You know, with that monarch at the very top. I mean, running his like his entertainment shows for himself. Yeah, that was his slogan, right? And then he was supported by, I suppose, the first two estates, right? Which, like, the landlords, the military generals, yeah, the court nobility, um,
Clergy.
the clergy, um, and the people that were being the people that were being harmed was the yeah, it was the urban middle class, which was small back then. Yeah, the peasantry, obviously. Um, yeah, so because I think you know because we have a feedback mechanisms today in the more democratic system today. I mean, I find it very unlikely that we would get to exactly that stage of the French Revolution, at least for now.
Yeah, a
Um,
detail I remember about the French Revolution is that the peasantry was at first not uh, indifferent to absolutism, but the bourgeoisie actually instigated them to join the ranks, uh, basically saying that peasants, you are citizens too, you are citizens too. That's how they gained manpower for the revolution.
um, yeah, and so ultimately, yeah. So this was the inclination, the first inklings of the bourgeois revolution. I would say the more meaningful one, however, was the 1848 uh, version, um, because it wasn't just France. I mean, this was now happening across continental Europe. Um, Only the British were probably the ones that were spared, but because in Britain the bourgeoisie was much more powerful already. So there was a glorious revolution of 1688, which confirmed the power of Parliament, weakened the power of the king. So it was so in Britain. I mean, the bourgeoisie already had the power. While I think in the continental European countries, it took a while before there was a bourgeois awakening. Um, and ultimately, I would say that it's the Brits who forced on the Europeans the social transformation. Because I mean, because if you look at a lot of like for instance the French producers, manufacturers in the mid 19th century, I mean they they wanted to have more political influence, um, because they felt that they were being squeezed out by the British producers. So as soon as you have industrial commodities, right, industrially produced commodities sold on the European market, and thereby destroying the guild system. The guilds were, I guess, the um, like it's a collective of small scale producers. Um, because you cannot produce at a low price as a small scale producer against mass manufacturing. Um, right. So so it's the cheap British commodities flooding the European markets that created the pressure um to reform the political institutions, away from the feudal system into its capitalist market oriented system. Um, and it's quite interesting because so after that succeeded in the second half of the 19th century, um, it is a model that eventually spreads throughout the world. I mean, and now it's like even developing countries today are saying, you know, can we adopt the lifestyle of the West? And so and going back to the Chinese case, I mean, I think the Chinese case is one of the most interesting ones because it is now a big country, so not just size of population, well, India has that too, but also the size of the economy. Um, and the institutions are still, you know, like the middle of the 20th century, like Communist Party in power. Um, so it's one of the interesting like hybrid combinations of we have this archaic system reserved from the, I guess, middle of the 20th century, and we want to be part of the modern capitalistic economy. Um, and now what we're observing is that the U.S. wants to prevent this movement. So I think every week, every month, I mean, there's something new that you find in the U.S. policy, which is China hostile. So one ruling was, okay, so if you're a U.S. national, you cannot work on semiconductor projects in China. I think that was a big one. Then the next one was, I think, like pressuring the European companies. So there's a Dutch company, I think ASML, which produces semiconductors, chips. Um, where now they're getting pressure to not supply China. So I mean, the attempt. So the logic in the Washington area is pretty clear, right? I mean, it's it's stopping China's rise to be number one in the economy. Um, so why am I worried about that? Well, because it's about the tendencies in geopolitical tensions, right? Because right now, so okay, basically, how do we keep Taiwan safe? I think that's a very relevant political question today.
No, it's not. It's just Taiwan is just a so that you have a stone to play at the board on China's court that you can play.
Is a peasant on a chessboard.
Yeah, it's a piece on the chessboard.
Um,
They don't give a shit about Chinese people. They don't
well,
give a shit about democracy either. It's just that they have some battle rhetoric or rhetoric. I don't know how you pronounce it.
yeah, I mean, it Well, so okay, so I mean, obviously, like if you live there, if you live on that island, I think that would be a very different calculation. I mean, the same thing with like are the Ukrainians just a peasant on the chessboard? I mean, in terms of within the larger power blocks, I mean, the
Pawn.
answer, yeah, are they the pawns? Well, it's a yes and a no, right? Because to the extent that they are fighting the war, I mean, actively, um, that's a source of agency, right? Because if there was no source of agency, then they fight for like 2 weeks and they get defeated, right? And then at that point, yeah, it's very low agency. I mean, to the extent that they're fighting and they're standing up and they're still standing, I think that's probably the source of agency, right? Um, and then the source of agency for the Taiwan conflict is that as long as the invasion, as long as there's no military means being used, right? Invasion hasn't happened, then then yes, I think then the main actor is going to be China. I mean, but at the moment where the invasion does get triggered, then I think it becomes complicated because if the Taiwanese say, okay, we're holding up, we're fending them off for weeks, maybe months, um, then maybe the U.S. has to intervene. Maybe Japan intervenes. Japan just announced that they double the military budget, so they're going to become the third biggest military spender in the world now. Um, Evidently, they're doing that. I mean, in response to what they perceive to be the China threat. Um, and if if the Japanese they are finished with the military built up, I mean, would they effectively give the security guarantees to Taiwan? I mean, it's a big question. Because if the answer is yes, then I mean, then yeah, we're talking about another. I mean, a huge conflict. I mean, not just U.S. China. Um. So again, I would say going back to the economic piece of the chessboard, you could say. Um. My take is that there's no alternative to better economic integration, even if it comes at the expense of the U.S. being number one economic power. Because I mean, to some extent, I mean, like, okay, the threshold for China becoming number one is much lower than for the US. Why? Because the population is 4 times bigger. So at the point at which China reaches 25% GDP per capita levels of the US, it already has a GDP that's equivalent to the US. So so in a sense, I mean, we can it's the China being number one economically, that's not avoidable at this point. Um, and I think that economic and trade integration is a way to sustain leverage over calculations in Beijing. Now, but then the anti-China side in Washington argues that, well, once China does become number one, they will have the resources to sustain the Taiwan invasion. Um, and they will also have the resources to sustain any economic sanctions that the U.S. wants to impose on them, and presumably they will get the other partners like the NATO, like the European countries, Japan, Australia, etc., on the board. Um, so it's so I guess I mean the big point really. So I'm not sure whether it's possible at all to you know reduce the military tensions. Uh, but I think it's still a safer route to sustain economic integration because then there's at least some some non-military leverage that the West has. Because right now it seems like the only leverage that the Biden administration has after burning all the economic bridges is a military threat. I mean, they'd be saying, "Well, okay, if you invade, then we fight too." But that's not the world that we should want to be in, right? Um, yeah. So I don't know. Any way to diffuse the military confrontation, I think, um would be quite positive. Um, but yeah, I mean, all the big powers are now arming up. I mean, Germany has this big armament package. In Poland, they just purchased 1,000 tanks. I think just from South Korea. Then they purchased 250 more tanks from the U.S. Um, I mean, so that's not a sign of impoverishment, effectively, right? Right, because if you're spending the money on the military, like you have to take resources away from the civilian economy. Whether it's like I don't know, instead of being home health aid or something, or uh, operating in warehouse logistics, I now have to become a factory worker to produce tanks. So I mean that's a. I mean you're effect. I mean you're producing something that does not satisfy the needs of the civilian population, right?
Yeah, but how much of the GDP are dedicating to arms manufacturing? Every country has to do that, or maintaining a military, rather. Because arms manufacturing is it's actually making money. South Koreans are profiting from selling their arms to Poland.
Yeah, I mean
What's
it's an
considered
industry.
healthy? How much percentage of the GDP should or could one country spend to maintain a standing military force?
Well, okay, so
3%. How much is the US spending?
well, so so there's only a practical answer to that, which is it depends on what is the threat assessment. So there's a political debate within each country, like how big is my neighboring country a threat to my own country. So that's really a subjective assessment. I mean, evidently we're seeing that the Eastern Europeans think that Russia is a bigger threat than the Western and the Central Europeans. Um, then then yeah. So this is a practical debate that would have to be made. Um,
Yeah, as I
I mean,
said, it's subjective. How how threatened does Switzerland feel? They're not surrounded by allies, but they're not surrounded by enemies either.
yeah, I mean, they seem to be feeling quite safe being surrounded by the NATO countries.
Yet they still field a vast army and armed citizenry, and they still have conscription.
Yeah, but I mean, it's clearly the case. I mean, like they know that if there was hypothetically a NATO plan to take over Switzerland, um, yeah, it would be accomplished, right? I mean, but then okay, well, why do you keep the military spending up, and why do you maintain an army?
Is a
It,
threat. That's a strategy for neutral countries, for small countries, to make it unappealing uh, to operate on your neutral homelands.
yes, but then I don't know. I mean, if you look at a country like Austria that maintains formal neutrality as well, um, but I mean, well, we both have experience there. I mean, it's a garbage army. I mean, it's not an army that would be able to um withstand any attacks from any neighbor, right?
It's
So
not about withstanding them or defend for indefinitely. It's about delaying the conquest. It's about wasting invaders' resources. It's an attrition game.
yeah, I mean, but it wouldn't. Yeah, it would not be a long battle for sure. I mean, it's not
No, it
that.
wouldn't be long. The target was what I've heard. It's 3 weeks. If you can delay total conquest or surrendering by 3 weeks, you achieved your goal.
Yeah, the yeah, it's hard to say what. So in Austria, evidently there was no debate about the NATO membership, unlike in Sweden and Finland. Um, I did a blog post about Finnish NATO membership, and I just dug into the history of Finland, and they had two big neighbors, Sweden and Russia, and they were a colony of Sweden up until I think 1700s, and then they became a colony of Russia. I think no, maybe 1800 or so. Um, well, not really a colony, but they were. It was like a dependency. They were a dependency of Russia.
And it
Um,
was a personal union or something.
yeah, and then the formal independence was acquired um, during World War One. There was an attempt by the Germans to capture Finland, and actually there was supposed to be a German prince, one of the Hohenzollerns, who was supposed to become the king. Um, and then, um, but then Germany lost World War One, and then that didn't happen. So then it eventually became a republic, um, and that went well for a few years, and then there was a Finnish-Soviet War, the Winter War in '39, the continuation war in between 1941 and 44, where the Nazis were backing the Finns to take back Lapland. Um, and of course the Nazis lost, and then the Finns lost the territory again. So I think from that history um, of trauma with Russia, I think that's where the NATO membership comes from. Finland had to retain a neutral status between 1945 and basically the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is why they waited for the EU membership until 1995. So it was really about learning how to be different to Russia, and therefore they have like this direct fear. Um, versus I think what's happening in the Austrian case. So first of all, I think there are deep economic relations similar to Germany and Hungary because of the gas dependence. Um, and also, I think there's a much deeper gratitude for Russia than, um, like, for instance, in Germany or Poland or there's other places, because the state neutrality treaty was about the Soviet soldiers pulling the troops out of Austria. So then you can spin the narrative that the Russians are the nice guys, and maybe that sort of, and also being surrounded by NATO countries is also helpful, right? Like there's not as much of a direct, immediate need to join NATO. Though if there was ever a military threat against Austria by Russia, which is unlikely because they would have to go through the other NATO countries first. Um, yeah, but there would be a possibility to join NATO as well. I think then the debate would be open up. Yeah, but you're gonna. I mean, ultimately, I think the big picture analysis is that, right. So what we might call like the Francis Fukuyama period, right? Basically between the end of the Cold War and, yeah, then now defining what the end date of that is going to be, I think, is much harder. Like, is it going to be the '08 financial crisis, right? Is it going to be the Brexit, Trump era? Is it going to be COVID pandemic? Is it going to be Ukraine war? I mean, it's quite arbitrary to set an end date to that sort of peaceful period. Um, but I think that we are at an end of a peaceful era, the lull period, at least within the Western world. Because I mean, you could say like in the Middle East. I mean, yeah, it's been a powder keg region. Well, I guess since the end of World War One, basically, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Um, yeah, but certainly for the Western countries, I mean, and even for East Asia, I think, yeah, the lull period is kind of seems to be coming to an end. Yeah, so yeah, and then on the question of like, what is overall sustainable, military spending, I think, yeah, as you say, so it's objective, and I think the boundaries are shifting. Um, I think we're getting to a stage where we're like, well, okay, we have to spend way more on the military. Um, I mean, the logic being you have to be ready for war if you don't want to fight one.
And when you say we, you mean we Europeans, we Westerners, Americans, because America never had a moment of peace in their 250-year history.
Well, so the American perspective is that, as long as the war is being fought far away, um, I guess the civil war would be maybe the domestic conflict, but the other wars were all foreign wars, and it's kept far away from the consciousness of the people. I mean,
Civil War. Mexican War preceded the Civil War.
Yeah, the U.S. Mexico War was 1845. And then, well, there was a Spanish American War in 1898, and World War One, two, Vietnam, Korea, Korea, Vietnam, and then Gulf War, and then you had Iraq, Afghanistan. And then now with the Ukraine war, I mean, it's hard to say because that's kind of like the Soviet Afghan war, right? Where the CIA was funding the Mujahideen, who ended up becoming the Taliban, who were hiding Osama bin Laden, who was behind 9/11. So that clearly backfired. But at least while the Soviet Afghan war was happening, and the CIA was supplying the Mujahideen, um, but from the American perspective, this was considered a success, right? Success as in it drained the treasury and the blood of the Soviet Union. Um, and 2 years after that, the Soviet Union collapsed. So I mean, it's not to say that the Soviet-Afghan War was the cause of the demise of the Soviet Union, but it was certainly one of the factors that was working against its existence. I mean, it's interesting. Like whenever you had these military defeat in Russia, I mean, the empire itself was threatened. So uh, the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, which was won by Japan, and effectively pushed the the Russians out of China and Korea, which then became the Japanese protectorate. Um, well, okay, that was not fatal yet. I mean, but then World War One was fatal. But the Russian Japanese War was still important because it's signaled that the Tsar is weak. Um, well, that's why, like, if you ask Putin, I mean, the people he admires, right? He's not gonna talk about Tsar Nicholas, who the last Tsar. I mean, he's always going to talk about Peter the Great because Peter the Great defeated the Swedish army in the Battle of Poltava in 1709. And then after that, the empire expanded to, yeah, big chunk of Eastern Europe.
Not to mention eastward through Siberia.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Russians, they will never lack land. I mean, they have lots of land. I mean, I think the problem for them is going to be the control that they have over those territories. So basically, because they're like there's republics within the Russian Federation. That's why it's called the Federation. That have their own non-Russian nationalities, right? So you have Dagestan, you have Chechnya, you have Buryatia. I mean, there's certain regions where there's some, you know, anti-Russian nationalism, right? And these sub-regional conflicts, they could flare up again if there's a recognition that the center is struggling, and the center is clearly struggling right now. So yeah, it is a gamble. I mean, it is a gamble to try to capture a whole country, uh, and it's clearly backfiring now.
Well, Russia historically has put a lot of effort to assimilate those ethnically different regions, teaching them Russian, etc. Nowadays, you would call it genocide, which I still not subscribe to that. It's just teaching people the lingua franca, like France has done with Britannia, or Britain has done with same with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland.
Well, I
Those
mean, so
processes have not been deemed genocidal, so I would not deem uh, teaching Russian to uh, the Perm people, which was a Ugric tribal kingdom somewhere in Siberia.
well, I mean, I think ultimately it's about the what is the status of the old language. So like when the Russian soldiers they occupy these Ukrainian territories, and they would implant the Russian teachers into the schools, into the local schools. They teach in Russian, obviously, but also they wouldn't be teaching in Ukrainian anymore, right? It would be to say, well, you're a Russian, therefore you will learn Russian and you will speak Russian, and I want you only to think in Russian. Um, and that's the proposition that I think is not acceptable to the Ukrainian authorities. And it's quite interesting because so the Ukrainian state they were aware that about 40% of the population was um, Russian speaking. So I think there was a respect for the Russian language for many years. And now the last couple of years after 2014, we have seen education laws in Ukraine, which was effectively reducing the Russian content in the education system. Um, but it was clearly a political decision, right? Because the whole point of it's like, okay, well, what's the point of having a Ukrainian state um, when Russia is also threatening you militarily? And then the answer would have to be, well, okay, so then we're going to teach the Ukrainian language. So then, because then you will feel pride of wanting to defend the Ukrainian state.
What time are we talking about? You mean
Yeah, so after 2014, right? So
okay?
after the seizure of Crimea and Donbass. That's when the Ukrainian state then changed the education laws to basically strip the Russian content from the education system. And I understand why this is happening, right? I mean, it was happening in response to that military threat. It wasn't that the Ukrainian state was intent on eradicating the Russian language. It was a direct response to the military threat because the Ukrainian state wanted to make sure that the population is standing behind the Ukrainian state, and educational indoctrination, if you want to call it that, is of course a part of that program, right? Um, so then, of course, well, but then this was the argument that that Putin was then using, right? It's like, oh my God, the Russian language is being attacked. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated conflict. I mean, that we unfortunately had to that the West unfortunately had to get itself into. I mean,
Mm.
okay, so if you don't have any other topics, then I think we'll call that podcast to an end.
Yep, I agree. I'm a
And
working person now. I should work tomorrow.
well,
That's
then
how life is, isn't it?
so workers of the world unite. You only have the chains to lose and the freedom to gain. I think it's the last line in the Communist Manifesto. Um, and
Interesting.
yeah, thanks to the listeners out there as well.